Hello world and welcome to the program. This is Alex and my weekly episode of Ukrainian Unleashed, a podcast where you'll get along with Ukrainians and also observe how the global scenery impacts Ukrainian society in these exciting times. We speak about events, trends, individuals and lifestyles of modern Ukrainians. So let's jump right in. In today's episode we will discover the younger generation, which is often called Generation Z. Let's try to understand their motives, lifestyles and future expectations. Are their tech mind and straightforward way of thinking the only features which distinguish them from other generations? And would Ukrainian teenagers somehow be different from their foreign peers? Let's find out who would be our disciples and what kind of world they'd like to build for all of us. Hello everyone, I'm very glad to come back with a new episode and hope you were looking forward to it too. I'm still very excited that I caught the opportunity to record the interview with my ex-colleague Alex, who made a trip around the globe last year. Honestly speaking, he became so inspired about this that started posting photos from his traveling in his newly created Telegram channel. So I hope his fire won't be put out and we'll see many excellent pictures from around the globe. As for me, I was celebrating the relaxing of quarantine restrictions this week. Such a relief to finally meet your friends and relatives, even though a lot of places are still closed for visiting in Odessa. But plenty of people are already going back to business, and when you can at least buy a coffee in the park, it seems like you couldn't ask for more. Seriously, when you spend the entire 2 months at home with the limited communication and possibility to go outside, even such a small thing like a cup of coffee in a park means a lot to you. And actually, I caught myself thinking that we people probably don't need a lot to feel the happiness and joy. True feelings are happening in our minds, not outside, and we are the only ones to form the reality we live in. You know what? In general, I consider myself as a very flexible person. I have repeatedly rebuilt my life and spontaneous solutions were never a problem. But quarantine really created some kind of separate microcosm for me. And now the future is so vague that everyone is just waiting and prefer not to react. Probably all of us, we want the world to be relaunched first and then to catch up with it. But if we keep it in trigger mode, how we expect it to happen, huh? While I've already shared some thoughts about the upcoming future in one of the previous episodes of this podcast, and I really think that we'll face some serious changes, taking into account that perhaps we'll need to build a new reality instead of trying to get back to normal. These changes might take a while, but also I decided to check on how these changes might affect different generations and their perception of all that is whirling along. Look, we now live in the world where 4 different generations are mixed, which are Babyboomers, Generation X, Generation Y, which is also called Millenials, and Generation Z, the latest one. So we can assume that we have 4 different behavioral patterns responding to the present situation, and most likely Generation Z, those who were born at the beginning of 2000s, will be the ones to get inspired the most by these extraordinary times. In general, these are people aged between 13 and 23 years. These are children of Generation X and Millennials. So let's say the oldest Gen Z kids were born in 1997. Let's keep that in mind. So I got very curious at understanding their motives, lifestyles and future expectations. What's your opinion about their tech mind and straightforward way of thinking? And would Ukrainian teenagers somehow be different from their foreign peers? Let's find out who would be our disciples and what kind of world they'd like to build for all of us. So, what do we know about younger generation, which is often called Gen Z, except that they want to work with cutting-edge technologies and yearn for more human connection? Probably to learn more is better to get along with them. Most likely they can be your kids, friends, or friends of your kids. For instance, I have a younger sister. Her name is Dasha. Hi Dasha, I know you listen to this episode as well. So she was born in 1997. and she is also from Generation Z, its oldest representative. So I mean that, of course, it's better to look them in the eye and see who they really are. And maybe some of our ideas about the way the things should be running would be opposed. I'm 29 years old and belong to Millennials, or Generation Y if we stick to the classic generations chart, and I argued a lot with my parents and still do. So I wonder, will this be even bigger case in the relationships with my kids? Well, of course, we are all different and there are a lot of things which doesn't depend on the generation, but on personality, education, age. But here I'd like to better understand our Ukrainian Gen Z and find out some tendencies. So I will also put a few short statements taken from the interviews made by The Village Ukraine with Ukrainian Gen Z representatives to make this episode even more compelling. So here we go. Indeed, now Gen Z is entering the workforce with a deep understanding of technology and how it can transform the way we live and work. By 2020, Gen Z will make up to 20% of a multi-generational workforce, and Ukraine is not an exception. Alexander Jagachak, passionate about decrypting generation values, states that Generation Z represent today's global youth, and by exceeding a population of 2 billion people, they are one of the largest and most influential audiences for brands to reach. They were expecting to make up to 40% of consumers this year. Well, I hope they still will, regardless of all the economic obstacles. So let's say not only that they carry a device with them, which can be remotely targeted at any time, of course, but they also sit on more money than any generation before at that age. Generation Z grows up in the Great Recession, which leaves them with a more traditional mentality regarding financial liability, personal success and lifestyle. Terrorism, violence and volatility give them a feeling of unsettlement. As we all know, today's teenagers were born and live in a post-digital era. They Google the information instead of asking somebody and appeal to their devices for a piece of advice. So they consider technologies and digitalization as integral part of their lives, and they expect the functionality of their devices to continuously mend. They give much more credits to new technologies and are confident about the possibility of technological power to make them the best of the best and the smartest of the smart. Chloe Comby is a British journalist, researcher and educational consultant, author of the book Generation Z, Their Voices, Their Lives, stresses out that for Gen Z, new influential information channels have appeared which have replaced the classic media like newspapers, magazines and television. Well, this impact is difficult to underestimate. Social media clearly defines what this generation is like. They are also the owners because they create content, upload information including photos and videos, and at the same time consumers or even employees of social networks. They create the brand of their personality. That means they turn themselves into a brand. Statistics shows that teenagers are on top when it comes to using YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, Tumblr, Tinder, TikTok, and this is their media universe. According to the nationwide survey, Ukrainian Generation Z, 91% of Ukrainian youth use social networks. Dasha, 19 years old. I don't follow famous people for the same reason why I don't watch national channels. I understand that this is a channel of a certain deputy and they show a certain image. I listen to smart people surrounding me. They show up with their point of view, they can think critically, their opinion do not depend on others, so I listen to them and build my vision. Reading Getting to Know Gen Z report published by Futurecast, which is a marketing consultancy that specializes in modern consumer behavior, I discovered plenty of really curious things. In resume, I can say that if we talk about aim to be successful and struggle for money and career advancement, Gen Z remind baby boomers very much. Their beliefs, however, tell a different story. And here is where they start looking like millennials in their liberal narrative about race, gender, identity and sexuality. They do care about tolerance, of course, and solidarity, even more than previous generations who were dreaming about changing the world. But it seems like youngsters are ready to take more radical actions. They distance themselves from social institutions like state power, financial system, education system, etc. Ukrainian youth are mostly not interested in politics. The most interesting for them might have been the current affairs of Ukraine, but in general, only 13% of them follow the news. Being politically active is important only for 20% of young Ukrainians. As for political leaders, they are completely distrusted by 3/4 of young people in Ukraine. Okay, while comparing Ukraine and the European Union on the quality of political system and living standards, young Ukrainians give the European Union an advantage in everything, and especially in terms of economic prosperity and welfare. Compared to other generations, Gen Z are becoming more involved in social activism at a much earlier stage in life. Teenagers today are overwhelmingly more accepting of differences and are quick to eliminate those brands that do not foster an inclusive community. Therefore, they strive for equality, advocate for the protection of civil rights, include members of the LGBTQ community, transgender people, and support the feminist movement. Nearly 60% of Ukrainian youth are proud or rather proud to be Ukrainian. Nick, 20 years old. Back in the high school in Zaporizhia, I worked in an organization that took care of the LGBTQ community. They held various meetings, discussions, lectures. Once I was offered to go to Kiev for Kiev Pride. I got very excited because I rarely left Zaporizhia except going a few times at sea as well as to Uman. When I arrived in Kiev, I was overjoyed. Over time, I began to gain more and more experience of social activities. Procter & Gamble researched in Ukraine and identified the professional interests of Generation Z. The most popular areas of interest for teenagers became IT, FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods, auditing and consulting. Generation Z least want to be engaged with banking institutions in Ukraine. They also would never work in companies that do not care about their customers and society but focus only on earnings. Ideal working schedule for them, flexible with the ability to work remotely at least 2 times a week. Office conditions should also be comfortable and tuned for productivity, with relaxation and play areas. It is also important for young people to have freedom of action. They want to decide themselves when to get to the tasks and not just follow the instructions. Nastya, 19 years old. I moved from Chernihiv to Kiev 3 years ago. I'm a third-year student of journalism, now in search of myself. During these 3 years, I have not understood whether journalism is what I was willing to do. As a child, I wrote short stories, so I thought about where else I can study, either in hometown as a teacher or a journalist in Kiev. Big city, great opportunities. I am satisfied that I moved to Kiev, but I haven't figured out my studies yet. So I played music, worked as a barista and as a waitress, sang, played the guitar, even went to the drawing school. They are to some extent socially isolated because they can communicate with friends, use messengers, have fun without leaving their room. Many teenagers stay at home, so socialization is not very active. Among the unique characteristics of Ukrainian teenagers is having a wide network of contacts, says Nadia Omelchenko, vice president at IT Integrator, including those from the other countries, and an incredible desire for maximum freedom and the opportunity to start their own business or to be self-employed. At the same time, Gen Z require employers to have interesting and clear goals, feedback, and the ability to balance between work and life. Nadia Omelchenko says, quote, "They are result-oriented, they want everything at once, they are patriotic, they consider opportunity to work abroad, but only for getting new experience, which will then be brought to Ukraine." Unquote. Today, many of youngsters from Generation Z do not even look to work in companies in the corporate sector and are primarily searching for jobs in startups and short-term projects. Julia Humena, HR manager at Biosfera, admits that, quote, they are confident, ambitious, demanding, and sometimes even too arrogant. They are not looking for a job, but for developing themselves. Generation Z is not ready to fully adapt to the rules and regulations of the company. They rather dictate their own. Therefore, companies in which the vast majority of employees are representatives of Gen Z are often forced to make concessions and listen to their demands, unquote. Ira, 21 years old. I am a co-founder of a design bureau. I develop websites and mobile applications. I studied to be a designer, but from the first year I realized that the education received at the academy is not enough. I went self-employed and was looking for clients. At the age of 18, I found my first job and moved to part-time education scheme. I worked in IT company and, with gaining more experience, decided to start something with my fiancé. Generation Z prefer to gain experience more than to own things, a real property. Young people are often not interested in possessing of the housing, car, and other material things. Let's be clear, they were not in an ideological conflict with those of their predecessors who, at a conscious age, lived in the Soviet era in Ukraine. Therefore, for them, the values of the Soviet period are a history. But in the Ukrainian context, they were witnessing two revolutions of Ukrainian modern history, the Orange and the Revolution of Dignity, even those who were still children in 2004 and 2014. Coronavirus will also stop future generations from long-time planning, as they will remember this episode, especially if their parents have had a hard time during the crisis. Young Ukrainians are mostly afraid of war and corruption, but are ready to put up with the latter, as the nationwide survey says. Economic issues and the need to earn for a living are young people's main concerns in Ukraine. Income level is still a key priority when choosing a job for 96% of young Ukrainians. Misha, 20 years old. I would like to earn at least $1,000. However, of course, there is no maximum level here. I don't need much for a living, but I want to travel, live separately, and at the same time to treat myself to a little more than going out for a walk every Friday and to visit more festivals. More and more we can observe the idea that traveling is scary because the news broadcasts negative information that in many countries some terrible events are happening, like crises, accidents, natural disasters. And so the idea that it is safer to stay at home arises. Besides, mental health problems are getting more evident all over the world today as children remain cut off from reality. Although a healthy and sober lifestyle is important for Generation Z, young people understand that a person's physical and psychological conditions are significant. They also pay a lot of attention to environmental issues, and this to some extent separates them from the older generation who act like they do not care at all about the future. If we do not invest in services for young people, education, in particular higher education, we will not be able to talk about sustainable development and productivity of the population. Funding for these areas is very important. Some parents are too concerned about the safety of their children, so they try to control and keep them close. This can have a negative impact because independence is so important to Generation Z. It is essential to develop teenagers' interests in the real world to maintain those interests and hobbies that are not related to technologies. The new Ukrainian school reform of the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine has been implemented in 2017. Its goal is to update the school program and bring Ukrainian education closer to the best European standards. An interdisciplinary approach called STEM, mix of science, technology, engineering and mathematics, is trending in Ukraine now. The essence of this approach is the simultaneous practical application of theoretical knowledge received from different scientific fields. Mastering this approach today is not just an addition to basic learning, but an objective necessity. Statistical data shows that even 1% of the population mastering STEM professions increases the country's GDP by $50 billion, and the need for STEM specialists is growing twice as fast as that of other professions. Involving children with disabilities in regular classes is a key for their socialization and self-realization. This is a global trend. Unfortunately, inclusion in Ukraine is still pending. Of course, there is still a long way to go, but in the last few years there has been significant progress in the modernization of education system in Ukraine. There are relevant, inexpensive state-supported IT solutions, and due to decentralization reform and allocation of funds from local budgets, they are actively implemented and available in regions. If we invest in political, economic, and social education, we will get a more stable Generation Z and upcoming Generation Alpha, the first to be born entirely in the 21st century. So the type of world they would aspire to build still originates from our current efforts. This was a new episode of Ukrainian Unleashed podcast. Thanks for being here with me. I also would love to thank Purple Planet for lovely musical compositions used in this episode. And also special thanks to the Village Ukraine journal for having a chance to use the extracts from the interviews they did with Generation Z representatives. I'd really appreciate your comments, reactions, and subscription to our podcast channels in your favorite podcast app. And we did our best to extend our presence all over the web. You may find us on Spotify, Radio Public, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, iTunes, TuneIn, Google Play Music, Deezer, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Overcast, Castbox, Player FM, Podknife, and of course check our pages in social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram accounts with fresh updates are waiting for you. Stay tuned for new episodes and keep safe.